I'm learning it. I moved to Paris about 3 months ago, so I am around. Hopefully, I'll get to see you guys more. But I was asked to come here after I spoke at eFounders about a month ago, probably, about how GitHub started, and I thought it might also be interesting for some of you. I assume most of you are technical. Maybe a couple of entrepreneurs. Who here sort of runs their own company or has a consultancy or something? Okay, a number of people. So I'll talk a little bit about how GitHub started and some of the stuff we went through, and then a bit about how we work, which is different than in some ways than a lot of the companies that might be helpful. So if you have a question at any time, raise your hand, ask me the question. You can ask it in French. It's quite unlikely that I'll understand it, but I will then answer whatever question I'd like to answer. So yeah, please do interrupt me, and then I'll do a little bit of questions and answers at the end, and then we'll move on. But so GitHub started about 6 years ago. It started as a side project. One of the interesting things about GitHub is that we never took we didn't take money. We didn't take any sort of angel investment, until we were 4 years in and over 150 employees, I think. So we bootstrapped the entire company for most of the history of the company. And so one of the things that's sort of interesting is that that's possible to do now with a lot of web-based companies, right? We didn't have to pay very much for hosting. We happen to have friends in the hosting business that sort of, we made a deal with where we would give them free repos for their customers, and they would give us, a discount on our hosting for a while, and that really helped us get going. And other than that, there weren't a lot of other costs, right? So you can do so much on the internet today with so few costs. And so it's really sort of fascinating. So we started up, the four of us. It was a side project. It started making money. We started spending that money on beer every night, which is about how much money it was making at first. And then over time, it became to the point where we could quit our jobs, and we each started sort of winding down what we were doing or quitting our jobs, and took money out of the company as a paycheck. And it was, I think when I started, I made probably a fifth of what I was making at the job that I had left. And every month we'd look in how many paying customers we had and how much money that was bringing every month, and we would increase all of our salaries by a couple $100 or something like that. So the bookkeepers hated us because we changed payroll every single month to try to keep ourselves from starving. And that lasted for probably 6 or 7 months until we got back up to sort of a normal salary in San Francisco. And then it was a year after I quit my job before we hired any other full-time developers. So it took a good amount of time until we had enough money where we could hire somebody other than the four of us. And then that ramped and ramped and ramped until 3 years later we had 100 developers on staff, and we started looking at investment opportunities because really at the time we didn't need it. And the best time to go asking people for money that you're trying to raise is when you don't need it at all. If you've ever tried to take a loan from somebody or something, that it works in that situation as well. So that's when we ended up sort of raising money. But I think one of the interesting things that if you guys are building your own company, or if you have a small team or something that I think might be useful to take from GitHub and sort of how we grew the company, is how we operated our team the whole time. So we were 4 technical co-founders, which is kind of rare. Usually you'll have a business person, somebody that has any idea how to run a business at all in the mix, which we never had. Which is sort of one of the reasons that we ended up taking money, is because we had no idea what we were doing in anything other than building a product. But we were all open source developers. And so if you've done open source development, if you've contributed to an open source project, hopefully you have. I think there's a whole nother talk that I have on why that's useful for developers and why that's useful for businesses. But if you've done that, you have some idea of how open source developers work, how teams that work on open source work together. And the way that GitHub has worked from the first day, from 6 years ago, is almost exactly the same as the way that we work on open source projects. We have probably 1,200 projects under the GitHub organization, and so we use GitHub to develop GitHub, and we have maybe 800 or something open source repositories, and then another, or I don't know, 600 open source repositories, 600 closed source repositories under our org. So we have a ton of repositories through the organization, and everybody works. It doesn't really matter whether I often actually don't realize some of the time if I'm working on a closed source repository that we only use internally, or if I'm working on an open source library, like I don't know if that library is shared or not, because the workflow is exactly the same, right? We work on everything within GitHub as though it were an open source repository. So some of the interesting things that brings up are everybody works from where they, like if you think about how an open source team works, right? And how that differs from maybe how the team in your company works. There's a lot of really interesting differences that GitHub doesn't have. And I think it's an interesting question as to why it's different inside of your company than it is within an open source repository. Like, what are you trying to solve? You get a lot of interesting things when you work like an open source project. So, for instance, everybody can work where they want to. So, when we started GitHub, there was the 4 of us, and we all worked from home or from cafes, very similar to the way that we would work on an open source project. We communicated entirely online. We used Campfire at the time. I would probably, if I started a company today, I would probably use Slack or something that's advanced in the last 20 years that Campfire is not. But we use chat to do everything, or IRC or something like that. We use chat to communicate everything. We use GitHub to communicate with code. And that's, to this day, still how most of the developers within GitHub communicate. So it didn't really matter where we were physically located. We could have been in New York, we could have been in San Francisco, or 1 block away from each other. In fact, if you go in the GitHub offices 6 years ago, or if you go in, well, we didn't have an office for 1.5 years, but if you went to the cafe we were working at, watching the people that own the cafe get mad at us for sitting there for 4 hours and like ordering 1 coffee, basically you wouldn't have seen us talk to each other, right? Like, we would sit across the table from each other and we'd chat to each other, which my wife always thought was because we were huge nerds, which it's only partially due to that. Most of it is due to anything that you say in person, you can't reference later. There's no URL for it. Anybody that's not at that table that's working on your team never gets to hear it. And so there's a lot of downsides to communicating with your voice in person, right? Where if you can do it online, you have it to reference later, you can talk about it later, you can argue about it later, and all of that is captured for new members of the team that come on later, or people that aren't there for some reason that day, or people that are working remotely. So all of our development teams still operate this way. We don't do weekly stand-ups. We communicate entirely online. We try to make sure that we almost never have meetings. We try to make sure that everything has a URL, that everything has context, and that somebody starting tomorrow has as much context as the people that are talking about something or trying to make a decision today. And most of that came from what we learned from doing open source work, right? All of the strengths of open source, we also wanted to be able to work that way in our corporation. And we continue, for almost all of the company, we continue to do that today. Another interesting thing that we evolved over time, then this is not sort of based on open source work, but it's something that we've come to rely on heavily. And I would, if you do operations work, ops work, DevOps, we do something called chat ops, which is instead of having our operations people shell into the machines that they're working on and try to debug problems, we try to write a layer in between that, which we use Hubot for, which is sort of our chat bot. And we do everything through our robot. So if our robot can't do something, so you can say, like, show me the load across all my machines, and it will go through and show the load across all the machines, or graph, like, show me the integral of this particular metric over the last 2 weeks compared to this other metric. And it'll go out, do that graph, and then throw it into the chat room. But the interesting thing about this is that anything it can't do, we write. Anything we can't do, if we have to shell into a machine and actually run something on the command line, then nobody else can see that, right? Because there's no way to share a command line. So if you have an ops team of 20 people or even 3, you can't see what everybody else is doing. You have to sort of rewrite it after the fact, or say, this is what I did. If you can do it in a chat room, if you can say, bring me these statistics, change the front end to doing this, like, shut down these services, and you can do that all in a chat room, then new people that come onto your ops team can lurk, right? They can come in and they can watch how you work, how your entire operations teams work. You can ask advice sort of while you're on what is essentially the command line. The chat room is the command line. You can ask advice from people. You can say, is this cool to do? You run it. You get the results back. Everybody sees it at the same time. It's a really interesting way of doing operations work in a manner that almost nobody does, and we've found incredibly useful. Because you can also go back in time and see how was this thing resolved, right? So you have sort of a history of how this operations work was resolved at some point, and you can learn from that and say, here's where maybe we should have done something different, or here's where this really helped us figure out what was happening. And so we have all these sort of case studies when we have new operations people or DevOps people join GitHub. We have case studies which are basically chat transcripts of this is when we got DDoSed, and this is how we mitigated it, and here's where we figured out what the problem was, and here are the tools that we've written since then to be able to, that we could have run at the time to find it faster. So a shared command line, using your chat room as a shared command line, I think, is very powerful, and it's something that we talk about internally as chat ops. And if you're not doing something like that, I would highly recommend using that, because it's really been super helpful for us. As far as, you okay? Is everybody okay? So yeah, so that's just sort of a short history of GitHub, a little bit about how we work. I would really like to emphasize the remote aspect. I think most people that I've met in France have been able to identify with this, because a lot of people work with companies that aren't based in France. So, I mean, one of the most fun things about working out of Paris for the last 3 months has been communicating with people in the United States that are 9 time zones away. I don't know if anybody's had to do that. It's really fun to stay up until 1 o'clock in the morning and take a conference call in my living room. I always look really good. I'm always at the top of my game mentally. So I'm always excited to be able to do that. But being able so when we started, we were all in San Francisco. Until we were about 13 or 14 people, we were all still in San Francisco, and we started hiring people that would move away because there was really no reason for them to be co-located. It's expensive in San Francisco, and so people started moving away. Today, we have 240 employees, and probably 70% of the company is remote. So it's actually really been important for us to keep these, like, it's hard now to start doing meetings because nobody's in the office, right? Everybody's traveling or living somewhere else. We rarely have, out of 240 people, we rarely have more than 60 people in the office on any day at all over the course of the entire day. So the office is our chat room, and our actual physical building is a place to meet occasionally for people that want to, or a quiet space to work on something without being interrupted, hopefully, right? So it's a sort of a different way of thinking about what you do in the office. And it's been really helpful for us in hiring people that don't want to live in Washington and work for Microsoft, or live in San Francisco and work for a big company. They can live wherever they want to live and be able to work, and all of the people that are working with them are doing that as well, which is very powerful. It's really useful for getting people that otherwise don't have the flexibility to move to wherever your office is, right? To not have to convince somebody to do that relocation. So yeah, remote work, if you can do it, it's very powerful. There's a lot of great benefits, and the way to do it is to think about your team, your development team, as an open source team. What would an open source team do to produce this product, and can we emulate that rather than doing what we've been doing as a sort of corporation for a long time. So that's it. That's tips and tricks for sort of how GitHub grew and how we work. Yeah.
Yeah, you would say it's important in a company to have a coffee machine where people can actually physically meet and chat to each other. How do you think this has not been important for your company?
So I think it is important to meet people in person. The way that we do that is we fly people together every quarter or a couple times a year. It also helps. It helps with the more strategic stuff, or like what do we want to do in the next 6 months type higher level discussions. It's very, very helpful to have people in person. And also, and probably what's closer to the coffee shop or the coffee machine feeling is to get people so that they see their coworkers as human beings. So if everybody's remote, and GitHub is like a lot of actually what I'm doing recently is trying to mitigate this problem, which is people that don't know other people. And if somebody started and you've never met them because you haven't been in the office for 6 months or you haven't been at the same time as they have, and they do something that makes your job somewhat harder, then you hate them, right? And it gets into like this Reddit like trolling, like fuck that guy, like, and you're like, you don't even know that guy, like think about why he did that, and like it takes extra mental cycles, and it's harder to empathize with people that you haven't met. People in the office, on the other hand, have the opposite sort of problem where they get to know each other too well, and then they form little cliques, or they date each other, or like there's all these like sort of other problems that come there. So what I've found we've had the least problems and sort of the most success with are people that work remotely because they don't have the sort of soap opera problems of working in the same office, but you bring them together once a quarter or something like that, rent an Airbnb, fly everybody in, set up fun stuff for them to do at night or whatever. Everybody bonds a lot. They're all their best friends. It's like a high school reunion or something, and then everybody goes home, and they, like during that week or whatever that we put them together, they get to know everybody, they bond, they form those sort of friendships that make it easier to empathize. And they also choose like, okay, here's what we're going to focus on for the next 3 months, so that when they go home and sit down, they have a long-term vision of here's what I'm going to work on until the next time we meet again. So we just concentrated, right, rather than having it happen for 5 minutes every day.
So there's any management, like team management? How do you manage teams?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We didn't have management for a very long time, until we were probably 200 people. It was basically the four of us that were the managers and the executives. So we kind of acted as co-CEOs. So we'd get together every week and we'd say, here's all the issues, and we'd all take them and we'd do the hirings and the firings. Personally, the four of us try to provide some general broad leadership for the company that was clear, and it became very difficult, and we couldn't give feedback to everybody properly. We couldn't really take feedback properly if people had problems with each other or whatever. So we ended up hiring managers. It's really difficult to do once you've gotten to that size and have not really had any management in place, because everybody we hired were developers and nobody really wanted to become managers. They wanted to code and not to talk to people all day. But they also didn't want me to go out and hire somebody that they'd never met that is now sort of effectively their boss, right? And so it became really, really difficult to do. I think we started getting feedback that it was something that we needed to do when we were probably 100 people, or maybe even less than that. And it was something we didn't actually implement effectively. We tried a couple different things, and we kept sort of coming back on them because they caused, in many cases, more problems than they solved. And eventually, we just like a month ago hired the first manager, like hired a manager. We got a couple people that had management experience or wanted to try it to do it, which we kind of got into over several months. And then we finally, after 240 employees, we hired one person that she's a manager of a team, and she was hired in to be a manager. So we're starting to do it. It's still kind of difficult. We're changing it a lot because we're just trying to put in a mechanism. We were doing it where everybody could work on basically whatever they wanted in sort of an open source fashion, right? So here's all the problems of the company, choose something you're passionate about, work on that. And it actually worked really well for a lot of stuff. It worked very poorly especially with remote workers, in letting people feel confident in what they're doing, right? So we had a lot of what's called imposter syndrome, where people thought they were doing a bad job because nobody was there to tell them that they were doing a good job. And so that was one of the main factors in making us go towards management, is so that people knew I will or would not get fired tomorrow, right? Which, like, people really didn't know that for a long time, unless they were just really confident. Which I mean, most computer programmers are very supremely confident in. Yeah, so we do now. We probably have I don't know, 10 or 15 managers, sort of, throughout the company. And all of them are different. Like engineering stuff is different than finance or sales or whatever. So we're working through it. But yeah, that sort of, does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah.
How did you discover Git?
How did I discover Git? I was working at a company. We were using Git. We were using Perforce for version control, and then we were using Git. I wrote this mechanism to use Git to deliver content to this big network of machines, and so I would do all of the low-level commands like lstree and writetree and like the really low-level stuff, and build up directories of content, and then have the other side fetch it and then pull over just the difference of what it had to what it needed, and Git handle all that logic for us. And so we were using it as a content delivery mechanism, content distribution mechanism. And then I learned that you could use it for version control as well. And I thought it was really cool, and I wrote a book on it that was published through Peepcode, which we just open sourced because the company that published it got bought, and they didn't want my stupid book. So they were like, we'll give you like $2,000 to buy out the rights so that we don't have to pay you anymore. And I said, nah, just open source it. And they were like, that is a much better idea. So that's open source now. You can find that online. But yeah, so I wrote a book, and that's how I actually met the other guys. Github was, I was the Git guy because I'd done all this low-level, ridiculous Git stuff that nobody had even really heard of Git. And so yeah, that's how I got into that. Cool. All right, and now I will hand it over to the guys that will talk about awesome Git stuff, way better than I probably could. And thank you very much.
Thank you.